The autumn wind whipped across the endless expanse of Thompson Ranch, carrying with it the scent of dying grass and distant storm clouds. Marcus Thompson stood on his front porch, coffee growing cold in his weathered hands, watching his cattle huddle together against the approaching cold front. 3 years of solitude had carved deep lines around his eyes, and his once powerful frame seemed diminished beneath the weight of grief that had settled on his shoulders like a heavy blanket. Tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. The ranch house behind him stood silent, its rooms echoing with memories of laughter that no longer filled the halls. Sarah's garden had long since surrendered to weeds, and the swing on the old oak tree hung motionless, a testament to dreams that had died with his wife's final breath. Mac had built this place for family, for children's voices and holiday gatherings. But now it served as little more than a monument to everything he had lost. As he turned to head back inside, something caught his eye in the distance. A small group was making its way up the long gravel drive that led to his house, moving slowly, deliberately. Max squinted against the fading daylight, trying to make sense of what he was seeing. A man and woman, walking rather than driving, with what appeared to be two small children trudging alongside them. Their clothes looked worn, their posture spoke of exhaustion, and something about their desperate pace made Mac's chest tighten with an emotion he hadn't felt in years. The family drew closer, and Mac could see more clearly now. The man was tall, but thin, his shoulders bent with worry, while the woman beside him carried herself with the careful dignity of someone trying to maintain strength in front of her children. The kids, a girl and a younger boy, clung to their parents' hands, their small faces pinched with hunger and cold. When they reached the bottom of his porch steps, the man looked up at Mac with eyes that held both pride and desperation, a combination that spoke of a good man pushed beyond his limits. "Please, sir," the man said, his voice hoarse with exhaustion, "we haven't eaten in days. Could you spare anything? We'll work for it, I promise. I'm good with my hands, and my wife, she's a teacher. We just need a chance." The words hung in the evening air between them, heavy with need and hope. Mac found himself staring down at this family, these strangers who had somehow found their way to his isolated ranch, and for the first time in 3 years, he felt something stir in his chest besides the familiar ache of loss. Mac Thompson had never intended to become a hermit. 3 years ago, this ranch had been alive with possibility, filled with plans for the future and dreams that seemed as solid as the fence posts that marked his property lines. He and Sarah had talked about children, about filling the empty bedrooms with laughter and the sound of running feet. They had imagined holiday dinners around the big oak table, birthday parties in the backyard, and generations of family memories being made within these walls. Cancer had stolen all of that in the span of 18 brutal months. Mac had watched his vibrant, beautiful wife fade away despite every treatment, every prayer, every desperate hope that modern medicine might offer them a miracle. When Sarah drew her final breath in the hospital room that had become their second home, something essential had died in Mac as well. He had retreated to the ranch and simply stopped living, existing instead in a gray world where each day blended seamlessly into the next. The townspeople of Millfield had tried to reach out. At first, his neighbor Frank Wilson had made countless attempts to draw him back into the community, showing up with casseroles and invitations to church dinners that Mac politely declined. Rosa Martinez, his housekeeper of 15 years, had stayed on. Despite his increasingly antisocial behavior, quietly maintaining the house and cooking meals that Mac barely touched. She understood grief in the way that only someone who had lost their own spouse could understand, and she gave him space while ensuring he didn't completely disappear into his sorrow. The ranch itself had suffered from his neglect. Once pristine, pastures now showed signs of poor maintenance, and several outbuildings needed repairs that Mac couldn't summon the energy to address. His cattle operation still functioned, but only because he employed a crew of reliable hands who worked with minimal supervision. Mac had become a ghost haunting his own property, going through the motions of ranching without any real engagement or purpose. On this particular November evening, as storm clouds gathered on the horizon and the temperature began its sharp descent toward freezing, Mac had been contemplating another solitary dinner and another night of mindless television. when the Miller family appeared at his door. Their arrival shattered the routine that had defined his existence for so long, forcing him to engage with the world beyond his self-imposed isolation. David Miller stood before him with the bearing of a man who had once commanded respect, but now found himself reduced to begging. His clothes, though clean, showed signs of hardware, and his shoes had holes that he had tried to patch with duct tape. Despite his obvious poverty, he maintained eye contact with Mac, refusing to let desperation rob him of his dignity. His wife Emma stood slightly behind him, one protective hand on each of their children, her own exhaustion evident in the way she swayed slightly on her feet. The children broke Mac's heart in ways he wasn't prepared for. The little girl, perhaps 8 years old, had Sarah's same shade of auburn hair, and she looked up at him with curious brown eyes that seemed far too wise for her age. The boy, younger by a year or two, pressed himself against his mother's side, thumb in his mouth despite being clearly too old for such comfort. Both children were thin, their clothes hanging loose on small frames that should have been rounded with childhood health. "How long since you've eaten?" Mac found himself asking. The words emerging before his rational mind could intervene. David's jaw tightened, and Mac could see the internal struggle between honesty and pride playing out across his features. 3 days, Emma answered quietly when her husband remained silent. "We had some crackers yesterday morning, but that's all." The admission hung in the air like an accusation against a world that would allow children to go hungry while good people struggled to survive. Mac felt something crack open inside his chest, a fissure in the wall he had built around his heart. Without conscious thought, he stepped aside and gestured toward his front door. "Come in," he said simply. Rosa left a pot roast in the slow cooker, and there's more than enough for everyone. The gratitude that flooded David's face was almost painful to witness. "Sir, we don't want charity. Just tell us what work needs doing, and we'll earn whatever you can spare." Mac looked down at the children, remembering Sarah's voice as she had talked about the kids they would never have, the family meals they would never share. "Eating a hot meal isn't charity," he said gruffly. "It's just human decency. We'll talk about work after you've got some food in you." Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The inside of the Thompson Ranch house revealed the careful maintenance of someone who cared deeply about preserving a home, even in the absence of family to fill it. Rosa's influence was evident everywhere, from the spotless kitchen to the fresh flowers she brought in twice a week despite Mac's protests that they were unnecessary. The living room was comfortable but showed little sign of recent use, its furniture arranged around a massive stone fireplace that hadn't seen a fire in months. Emma Miller's trained eye took in the details that spoke of a house that had once been truly lived in. Family photographs lined the mantelpiece, showing a younger version of Mac alongside a beautiful woman with kind eyes and an infectious smile. The kitchen table was large enough to seat 8, but was currently set for 1, a stark reminder of the solitude that defined Mac's current existence. Children's artwork was still displayed on the refrigerator door, though the crayon drawings had obviously been created by visiting nieces or nephews rather than children who lived in this house. As Mac busied himself setting additional places at the table and heating up Rosa's pot roast, the Miller family settled tentatively onto the kitchen chairs, their posture reflecting the careful positioning of people who weren't certain they were truly welcome. The children's eyes were wide as they took in the abundance of a kitchen that clearly never wanted for food, from the well-stocked pantry to the fruit bowl that overflowed with apples and oranges. "My name's David Miller," the father said, extending his hand to Mac with the formal courtesy of a man determined to maintain his dignity despite his circumstances. "This is my wife Emma, and our children Sophie and Tommy. We're grateful for your kindness, more than we can express." Mac shook David's hand, noting the firm grip and the calluses that spoke of manual labor. "Marcus Thompson, but most folks call me Mac. This is my place, has been for 12 years now." He gestured around the kitchen. "Used to be livelier than this, but it's just me these days." The meal that followed was the first time in 3 years that the Thompson kitchen had served its intended purpose. Rosa's pot roast was tender and flavorful, accompanied by vegetables from her garden and fresh bread that Mac had never learned to appreciate when he ate alone. The children approached their plates with the careful restraint of kids who had learned not to take food for granted, but their obvious hunger soon overcame their politeness. Sophie and Tommy ate with the focused intensity of the truly starved, while their parents watched with the painful relief of those who had feared they might not be able to provide for their children. "This is incredible," Emma said quietly, her voice thick with emotion. "I can't remember the last time the kids had a meal like this." Mac found himself studying the family across his table, trying to piece together their story from the clues they presented. David had the soft hands of someone who had worked in an office rather than outdoors, but recent calluses suggested he had been taking whatever physical labor he could find. Emma's clothes were well-made but worn, the kind of professional attire that a teacher might wear, now showing the effects of too many washings and not enough replacement options. The children were clearly well-loved and well-raised, their table manners impeccable despite their hunger, but their clothes hung loose on frames that had lost too much weight too quickly. "Where are you folks from?" Mac asked, refilling Tommy's milk glass for the third time. "Right here in Millfield, actually," David replied, his voice carrying a note of bitter irony. "We lived on Maple Street for 8 years, ever since Sophie was born. I worked at First National Bank, and Emma taught 3rd grade at the elementary school." The past tense in David's statement wasn't lost on Mac. "What happened?" David and Emma exchanged a glance loaded with shared pain and frustration. "I found some irregularities in the bank's loan documentation," David said carefully. "Foreclosures that didn't follow proper procedures, paperwork that had been altered after the fact. When I brought it to my supervisor's attention, I was told to mind my own business." David couldn't let it go, Emma added, pride and worry warring in her voice. He kept digging, trying to understand what was happening. There were families losing their homes when they shouldn't have been, people who had made their payments but were being foreclosed on anyway. And then one day, I was called into the president's office and told my position was being eliminated, David continued. 2 weeks later, our own mortgage payment was mysteriously lost by the bank, and suddenly we were behind on our house payment. Within a month, we were facing foreclosure ourselves. Max set down his coffee cup with deliberate care, beginning to understand the larger picture that was emerging. "How long ago was this?" 6 months, Emma replied. "We fought it as long as we could, but legal help costs money we didn't have. We lost the house last month and have been staying in a trailer park on the edge of town, but when David couldn't find steady work, we couldn't even afford that anymore. We've been sleeping in our car for the past week," David added, the admission clearly costing him. "But with this cold front coming in, we knew we had to find something better for the kids. We were walking along the county road, hoping to find a farm that might need day laborers, when we saw your place." The story they told was becoming sickeningly familiar to Mac, though he had been too isolated to pay attention to the broader patterns affecting his community. He had heard mentions of unusual foreclosure activity in Millfield, but had dismissed it as the natural consequences of economic hardship rather than something more sinister. Now, looking at this obviously decent family who had been systematically destroyed for asking inconvenient questions, Mac felt the anger begin to burn in his chest that he hadn't experienced since Sarah's death. "Who runs First National now?" Mac asked, though he suspected he already knew the answer. "Richard Blackwood bought it last year," David replied. "He's been acquiring a lot of properties in town, always seems to know which ones are going to become available before they hit the market." Mac's jaw tightened. Richard Blackwood was a name that carried weight in Riverside County, a self-made businessman who had built a real estate empire through what many considered aggressive but legal business practices. He owned strip malls in 3 counties, had development projects throughout the region, and maintained close relationships with local politicians who seemed eager to accommodate his expansion plans. If Blackwood was involved in systematic foreclosure fraud, it would explain how he had been able to acquire so much prime real estate at below-market prices. "You mentioned altered paperwork," Max said, leaning forward with interest. "Do you have any evidence of that?" David's expression grew cautious. "Some. I managed to copy a few files before I was fired, but I'm not sure they prove anything conclusive. Blackwood's people are careful, and they have lawyers who know how to make problems disappear." "What kind of problems?" Mac pressed. "Other people who asked too many questions," Emma said quietly. "Families who tried to fight their foreclosures, journalists who started investigating the bank's practices. They don't get hurt physically, but they find themselves facing legal troubles, or their businesses suddenly fail inspections, or their children have problems at school. It's like the whole system turns against them until they give up and leave town. Mac absorbed this information with growing unease. The picture that was emerging suggested a level of corruption that went far beyond simple business misconduct. If Blackwood had the influence to manipulate the legal system, the schools, and local government to silence opposition, then the Miller family was facing an enemy with resources and connections that dwarfed their ability to fight back. "Where do you plan to go from here?" Mac asked, though the question felt inadequate given the scope of their situation. "We don't know," David admitted, his voice heavy with defeat. "We've applied for jobs in Austin, San Antonio, anywhere that might offer a fresh start. But without an address, without references that won't be poisoned by Blackwood's influence, it's hard to get anyone to take us seriously." Looking at the children, Sophie and Tommy, who had finished their meal and were now drowsing against their parents' sides, Mac felt something shift inside him that he hadn't experienced since Sarah's death. These kids reminded him of the family he and Sarah had dreamed of having. But more than that, they represented innocence under attack by forces beyond their control. The Miller family's story awakened something protective in Mac that he had thought died with his wife, a sense of purpose that extended beyond his own grief and isolation. "You'll stay here tonight," Mac said suddenly, the decision surprising him as much as it did the Millers. "Rosa keeps the guest rooms ready, and it's going to freeze tonight. No one should be sleeping in a car in this weather." The gratitude that flooded David and Emma's faces was almost overwhelming. "Mac, we can't accept that without working for it," David protested. "Just tell us what needs doing, and we'll start first thing in the morning." Mac looked around his kitchen, seeing it for the first time in years as a space meant for family rather than solitary existence. "We'll figure out the work situation tomorrow," he said gruffly. "Right now, let's just get everyone settled for the night." As he led the Miller family upstairs to the guest bedrooms that hadn't been used since Sarah's funeral, Mac felt the first stirrings of something he had thought was lost forever. For 3 years, he had existed in a gray world where each day was simply something to be endured until the next one arrived. But tonight, as he listened to children's voices in his house for the first time in years and watched Emma tuck her kids into beds that had been waiting empty for far too long, Mac Thompson began to remember what it felt like to have a purpose beyond mere survival. The storm that had been threatening all evening finally arrived as the family settled in for the night, wind howling around the ranch house and rattling the windows with its fury. But inside, warm and safe and well-fed for the first time in weeks, the Miller family slept the deep sleep of those who had found unexpected sanctuary. And down the hall, Mac Thompson lay awake listening to the sounds of a house that was finally, once again, a home. Dawn broke gray and cold across Thompson Ranch, the kind of Texas morning that promised a harsh winter ahead. Mac had been awake since 4:30, old habits from decades of ranching impossible to break even when grief had stolen his motivation for most everything else. He stood at his kitchen window, watching frost glitter on the fence posts while coffee brewed behind him, and found himself listening for sounds from upstairs that he hadn't heard in his house for 3 years. The soft murmur of children's voices drifted down from the guest bedrooms, followed by Emma's gentle shushing and David's deeper tones as the family stirred to wakefulness. Mac felt an unexpected tightness in his chest, a mixture of warmth and pain that reminded him of Christmas mornings when his nephews had visited, back when Sarah was alive and the house had regularly filled with extended family during the holidays. Rosa would arrive soon, as she did every morning at 6 sharp, and Mac found himself wondering what his longtime housekeeper would make of his unexpected guests. Rosa Martinez had worked for the Thompson family since Mac and Sarah had first bought the ranch, and she had been the one constant source of human contact during his 3 years of self-imposed isolation. She had a sixth sense about people that Mac had learned to trust, and her opinion of the Miller family would carry significant weight in whatever decisions lay ahead. Footsteps on the stairs announced David's arrival in the kitchen, the banker, moving quietly in deference to his sleeping children. He had clearly made an effort to clean up as much as possible, his hair damp from washing and his clothes straightened despite their obvious wear. The man's posture spoke of someone trying to maintain dignity while navigating the uncomfortable position of being dependent on a stranger's charity. "Good morning," David said softly, his voice carrying the formal courtesy of someone unsure of his welcome. "I hope we didn't disturb you. The children aren't used to sleeping somewhere new, and Tommy had a nightmare around midnight." Mac waved off the concern, pouring a second cup of coffee and offering it to David. "House hasn't had kids in it for years. Takes some adjustment for everyone." He studied David's face in the morning light, noting the dark circles under his eyes and the tension that seemed permanently etched around his mouth. "How long since you've slept through the night?" The question seemed to catch David off guard, and for a moment his carefully maintained composure slipped. "Honestly, months. When you're sleeping in a car with two young children, every sound could be trouble. Last night was the first time in weeks that Emma and I both slept at the same time instead of taking turns keeping watch." The admission revealed layers of hardship that went beyond simple homelessness. Mac had grown up during leaner times, when ranch families understood the necessity of mutual support during difficult periods, but he had never experienced the particular vulnerability of being homeless with children in an urban environment. The idea of David and Emma taking shifts to guard their sleeping children painted a picture of desperation that made Mac's isolated grief seem almost luxurious by comparison. "Tell me more about what happened at the bank," Mac said, settling into his chair at the kitchen table. "You mentioned finding irregularities in loan documentation. What exactly did you discover?" David's expression grew cautious, the wariness of someone who had learned that asking the wrong questions could destroy his life. "Are you sure you want to hear this?" People who get involved in questioning Blackwood's business practices tend to find themselves facing problems they never expected. "I'm asking," Mac replied simply, his tone making it clear that warnings about potential consequences wouldn't deter him. David took a deep breath, seeming to weigh his words carefully. "It started with a foreclosure file that crossed my desk for processing. The Hernandez family, who owned a small ranch about 20 miles south of here. According to their payment records, they were current on their mortgage, but the foreclosure paperwork showed them as being 6 months behind." Mac leaned forward, his interest sharpening. The Hernandez family had been fixture in the local ranching community for 2 generations, known for their honest dealings and meticulous business practices. The idea that they would fall behind on payments without exhausting every other option seemed unlikely. "I pulled their complete file to double-check the payment history," David continued. "That's when I noticed that several payment entries had been altered. Not obviously, but when you work with financial documents every day, you learn to spot inconsistencies in handwriting, different ink colors, numbers that don't quite align properly." "What kind of alterations?" "Payments that had been recorded as received were changed to show as missed. Late fees that hadn't existed were backdated and added to their balance. Their account had been systematically manipulated to create an artificial default that justified foreclosure proceedings." The scope of the fraud David was describing sent a chill through Mac that had nothing to do with the morning cold. "How many other files showed similar problems?" "That's what I tried to find out," David said, his voice growing bitter. "I started pulling random foreclosure files, looking for patterns. Out of the first 20 I examined, 12 showed signs of altered documentation. All of them were properties that Blackwood's development company ended up purchasing at foreclosure auctions, usually for significantly less than their appraised value." Emma's voice from the doorway interrupted their conversation. "He stayed late every night for 2 weeks, going through files and copying documentation. I kept telling him to be careful, that he was putting his job at risk, but David has this thing about right and wrong that doesn't allow for compromise." Mac turned to see Emma entering the kitchen, her hair pulled back in a simple ponytail, and her clothes the same worn but clean outfit from the previous evening. Despite their circumstances, she carried herself with the quiet dignity of someone who refused to let poverty define her worth. Behind her, Sophie and Tommy peered shyly around the doorframe, clearly hungry but uncertain about venturing into an unfamiliar kitchen. "Good morning," Max said, addressing the children directly. "Rosa left some pancake batter in the refrigerator yesterday. Anyone interested in breakfast?" The transformation in the children's faces was immediate and heartbreaking. Sophie's eyes lit up with the kind of excitement that only a hungry child could feel about the prospect of a hot breakfast, while Tommy emerged from behind his mother to nod enthusiastically. Mac found himself remembering Sarah's plans for lazy Saturday mornings with children, imaginary scenes of family breakfasts that would now never happen. As Mac busied himself with the pancake griddle, Emma helped set the table while David continued his story. After I documented the pattern in the foreclosure files, I took my findings to my supervisor, thinking the bank would want to investigate potential fraud in their loan portfolio. Instead, I was told that questioning the integrity of our foreclosure process was beyond my job description and that I should focus on my assigned duties. Who was your supervisor? Mac asked, flipping pancakes with more attention than the task required. Janet Morrison, the senior loan officer. She'd been with the bank for 15 years and had always been supportive of my work. But when I brought her the evidence of document alterations, it was like she became a different person. Cold, defensive, almost angry that I had uncovered the information. Emma sat down with the children, cutting Tommy's pancakes into manageable pieces while Sophie attacked her stack with the enthusiasm of someone making up for lost meals. That's when things started getting strange at work for David. Suddenly, his access to certain files was restricted. Meetings he had always attended were rescheduled without notice. His computer password was changed twice in 1 week for security upgrades that affected no one else. I knew I was being pushed out, David said, accepting a plate of pancakes from Mac. But I thought if I could just gather enough evidence, document the scope of the fraud clearly enough, someone would have to listen. I started coming in early and staying late, copying files when the office was empty. How much evidence did you manage to collect? Mac asked. David reached into his jacket pocket and withdrew a small flash drive. 43 foreclosure files showing clear evidence of document alteration. Payment records that had been changed after the fact. Late fees that were backdated. Interest calculations that didn't match the loan terms. All of it pointing to a systematic effort to manufacture defaults that would justify foreclosure proceedings. Max stared at the small device, understanding that it contained information that could potentially destroy Richard Blackwood's empire, while explaining how so many local families had lost their homes under questionable circumstances. Have you shown this to anyone? I tried, Emma said, her voice heavy with frustration. We took it to the county attorney's office, but were told that civil matters between banks and borrowers weren't something they could investigate without a formal complaint from the affected parties. When we tried to contact some of the foreclosed families, we discovered that most of them had left the area. The few we could find were too frightened or too defeated to get involved in challenging. Blackwood, what about the State Banking Commission? Mac asked. We filed a complaint, David replied. 3 months ago, we received a form letter acknowledging receipt of our concerns and informing us that the matter was under review. That was the last we heard from them. The picture that was emerging painted Blackwood as someone with influence extending far beyond the local level, someone with connections that allowed him to neutralize threats through official channels before they could gain traction. Mac had lived in rural Texas long enough to understand how small-town power structures operated. But the scope of corruption David was describing suggested something much more sophisticated and far-reaching. Rosa's arrival interrupted their conversation, the housekeeper's key turning in the back door as she arrived for her daily routine. Mac heard her pause in the mudroom, clearly surprised by the voices and cooking smells that indicated the house was more active than usual. When she entered the kitchen, her dark eyes quickly took in the scene before her, assessing the Miller family with the sharp attention of someone accustomed to reading people quickly and accurately. Rosa, I'd like you to meet the Miller family, Max said, rising from his chair. David, Emma, Sophie, and Tommy. They're going to be staying with us for a while. Rosa nodded politely to the adults, then focused her attention on the children, with the particular warmth she reserved for young ones. Buenos dias, Sophie and Tommy. Are you enjoying your breakfast? Yes, ma'am, Sophie replied solemnly. Mr. Mac makes really good pancakes. We haven't had pancakes in a long time. Something in the child's innocent statement caused Rosa's expression to shift, her maternal instincts clearly recognizing the subtext of a family that had been struggling with basic necessities. She moved to the stove and began assembling additional breakfast items, bacon and eggs appearing as if by magic to supplement the meal Mac had started. Rosa has been taking care of this house longer than anyone, Mac explained to the Millers. If she approves of you staying here, then it's settled. If she doesn't, then we'll need to discuss other arrangements. The statement was delivered with enough humor to soften its implications, but Mac genuinely valued Rose's judgment about people. During the darkest period of his grief, when well-meaning neighbors and distant relatives had tried to insert themselves into his life, Rosa had been the one to distinguish between those who genuinely cared about his welfare and those who were merely curious about his circumstances. "Tell me," Rosa said to Emma as she worked at the stove, "what kind of teacher were you?" "Third grade," Emma replied. "I taught at Millfield Elementary for 6 years. I loved working with children that age, when they're still excited about learning, and haven't yet decided that school is something to be endured rather than enjoyed." Rosa nodded approvingly. "Good teachers are precious. My grandson struggled with reading until he had a teacher who took extra time with him. Made all the difference in his life." She glanced at Mac with an expression that clearly communicated her assessment of the situation. Children need stability, especially when their world has been turned upside down. The endorsement was subtle but unmistakable, and Mac felt a sense of relief that he hadn't realized he needed. Rosa's approval meant that his instinctive decision to help the Miller family aligned with her more practical assessment of their character and needs. As the breakfast conversation continued, Mac found himself studying the family dynamics that were emerging in the comfortable environment of his kitchen. David clearly carried the weight of responsibility for their situation, his guilt over losing his job and their home evident in the way he monitored his wife and children for signs of need or discomfort. Emma balanced her own worry with determined optimism, working to maintain normalcy for Sophie and Tommy while supporting her husband's fragile confidence. The children revealed their own coping mechanisms as they relaxed in the warmth and safety of the ranch house. Sophie had assumed a protective role toward her younger brother, automatically cutting his food and ensuring he had everything he needed before attending to her own meal. Tommy, despite being only 6, showed the heightened awareness of a child who had learned to read adult emotions for signs of danger or distress. "What are your plans for today?" Mac asked as the meal wound down. David straightened in his chair, clearly eager to demonstrate his willingness to work for their accommodation. "Whatever you need done around the ranch. I know I don't have experience with cattle or farm equipment, but I'm willing to learn and I work hard." Mac appreciated the offer, but he was already forming ideas that went beyond simple manual labor. "Actually, I'd like to take a look at that evidence you collected. If Blackwood is running systematic foreclosure fraud, there might be other people who need to know about it." "Mac," Emma said carefully, "you need to understand what you'd be getting into." David lost his job for asking questions about Blackwood's business practices. Other people who have tried to oppose him have faced legal harassment, business problems, even threats to their families. He has connections throughout the county government, and he doesn't hesitate to use them against people who cause him trouble. The warning was delivered with genuine concern, but Mac felt the stirrings of something he hadn't experienced since Sarah's death. Purpose. For 3 years, he had drifted through his days without any goal beyond basic survival, but the Miller family situation offered him something worth fighting for. The injustice of their circumstances, the systematic nature of Blackwood's fraud, and the vulnerability of the children who had suffered because of adult greed combined to awaken protective instincts that Mac had thought died with his wife. "I appreciate the warning," Mac said quietly, "but I'm not some desperate family trying to fight the system alone. I have resources, connections, and frankly nothing left to lose that matters more than doing what's right." The statement hung in the morning air, carrying implications that extended far beyond simple charity or temporary assistance. Mac Thompson was making a commitment that would transform his life as much as it would the Miller family's future, though none of them yet understood the full scope of what lay ahead. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across the Thompson Ranch. As Max sat in his home office, a room that had remained largely unused since Sarah's death, David Miller sat across from him, the flash drive containing evidence of Blackwood's foreclosure fraud connected to Mac's laptop, its contents spread across the screen in a damning array of altered documents and manipulated records. Each file David had copied told a story of systematic theft disguised as legitimate banking practices. The Rodriguez family had lost their auto repair shop when late fees were retroactively added to their commercial loan. The elderly Wilson couple had been foreclosed upon despite having set up automatic payments that the bank claimed never to have received. Young families, established businesses, and retirement-age homeowners had all fallen victim to the same pattern of manufactured defaults and suspicious documentation. "This is worse than I initially thought," Max said, scrolling through payment records that showed clear evidence of alteration. Blackwood isn't just stealing individual properties. He's systematically dismantling the economic foundation of this entire community. David nodded grimly. That's what Emma and I realized as we looked at the bigger picture. Every foreclosed property ends up in Blackwood's development portfolio. He's been acquiring prime real estate throughout the county at below-market prices, then either holding it for future development or flipping it to corporate buyers who turn family farms into industrial operations. Mac leaned back in his chair, processing the scope of what David had uncovered. How many families have been affected? Based on the files I could access, at least 60 over the past 2 years. But those are just the ones that came through my department at the bank. Blackwood owns 3 other financial institutions in neighboring counties, and if he's running the same operation there, the number could be in the hundreds. The scale of the fraud was staggering, representing not just individual tragedies, but a coordinated assault on the traditional rural economy that had sustained communities like Millfield for generations. Mac had lived through economic downturns before, had seen families struggle with genuine financial hardship, but this was different. This was predatory, calculated, and designed to concentrate wealth and property in the hands of a single man, who viewed other people's homes and livelihoods as commodities to be manipulated. "Tell me about the people who tried to fight back," Max said. Emma mentioned that others who questioned Blackwood's practices faced retaliation. David's expression grew dark. Tom Anderson owned a small construction company that specialized in custom homes. When 3 of his clients lost their houses to questionable foreclosures, he started asking questions about the bank's lending practices. Within a month, the city building department began finding violations in his work that had never been problems before. His business insurance was canceled for elevated risk factors that his agent couldn't explain. He ended up closing his company and moving to Oklahoma. What about Maria Santos, the reporter who was investigating the foreclosure pattern? Mac asked, recalling a name that had come up in their earlier conversation. Maria worked for the county newspaper and started connecting the dots between Blackwood's property acquisitions and the unusual number of foreclosures. She was preparing a series of investigative articles when someone broke into her apartment and stole her computer and all her notes. The police said it looked like a random burglary, but nothing else was taken. Her editor decided the story was too controversial and reassigned her to covering school board meetings and county fair results. Mac felt a cold anger building in his chest, the kind of righteous fury that had been absent from his emotional landscape since Sarah's death. And the families who lost their homes? Why won't they come forward to support an investigation? Fear, mostly, and practical considerations. David pulled up another file on the laptop, showing a foreclosure case from 8 months earlier. The Garrett family fought their foreclosure in court, claiming the bank had misapplied their payments and charged illegal fees. They spent their entire savings on legal fees, and when they lost the case, they also found themselves facing a countersuit for frivolous litigation that left them owing the bank an additional $40,000. The picture that emerged was one of systematic intimidation designed to discourage opposition through overwhelming legal and financial pressure. Blackwood had created a system where fighting back was more costly than accepting defeat, where families, who might have had valid claims, were scared into silence by the prospect of even greater losses. What about law enforcement? Mac asked. Surely someone in the sheriff's department or the district attorney's office would be interested in this level of fraud. David's laugh was bitter. Sheriff Morrison is Richard Blackwood's brother-in-law. The district attorney's last campaign was heavily funded by Blackwood's various business interests. The county commissioners include 2 people who sold their land to Blackwood at prices that were unusually generous, if you know what I mean. Mac was beginning to understand the full scope of the corruption they were facing. Blackwood hadn't simply built a business empire. He had systematically purchased the political and legal infrastructure necessary to protect his operations from scrutiny. The Miller family wasn't just fighting a fraudulent bank. They were opposing an entire network of compromised officials and intimidated citizens. So what do you need? Mac asked, the question carrying more weight than a simple offer of assistance. David looked surprised by the directness of the question. I'm sorry. You came to my door last night with your family, hungry and homeless, asking for help. Now I understand that what you really need isn't just food and shelter. You need someone with the resources and connections to take on a fight that destroyed your life when you tried to handle it alone. So what do you need? The offer was delivered with the matter-of-fact practicality that had characterized Mac's approach to ranching for decades. Problems required solutions, and solutions required honest assessment of available resources and necessary actions. Mac Thompson had spent 3 years wallowing in grief and isolation, but David Miller's story had awakened something in him that demanded action rather than sympathy. Mac, you don't understand what you'd be taking on, Emma said from the doorway, where she had been listening to their conversation while keeping an eye on the children playing in the living room. Blackwood has destroyed everyone who has tried to oppose him. We're talking about someone with millions of dollars, political connections, and a willingness to use any method necessary to protect his interests. I understand exactly what I'd be taking on, Mac replied. The question is whether you're willing to let me help you do it right. David and Emma exchanged a glance loaded with shared history and mutual concern. For months, they had carried the burden of their knowledge alone, trying to find someone willing to listen while watching their own lives disintegrate under the pressure of opposing forces beyond their control. The offer of genuine support from someone with Mac's resources was both hopeful and terrifying. What did you have in mind? David asked carefully. Mac stood and moved to the window overlooking his ranch, where cattle grazed peacefully in fields that represented generations of honest work and family legacy. First, we need to understand the full scope of Blackwood's operation. That means identifying every family that has been affected and documenting the pattern of fraud in a way that can't be dismissed or ignored. How do we do that when most of the victims have left the area or are too frightened to come forward? We find them. We reach out through networks that Blackwood doesn't control. Churches, veterans organizations, former employees of affected businesses. People talk to their friends and family about what happened to them, even when they won't talk to reporters or investigators. Emma joined them at the window, her teacher's mind clearly working through the practical challenges of Mac's proposal. Even if we could identify all the victims and get them to cooperate, Blackwood has demonstrated that he can neutralize threats through the local legal system. What makes you think a larger investigation would be any different? Because we won't be working through the local legal system, Mac said simply. Fraud on this scale crosses state lines and involves federally insured financial institutions. That makes it a federal matter, and Blackwood's influence doesn't extend to FBI field offices in Dallas or federal prosecutors in Austin. The suggestion carried implications that extended far beyond their immediate situation. Taking on Richard Blackwood through federal channels would require evidence standards that exceeded anything David had been able to gather alone, legal expertise that would cost hundreds of thousands of dollars, and a commitment to a fight that could take years to resolve. Mac, the legal costs alone would be enormous, David said. We're talking about challenging a man who has unlimited resources to defend himself. Even if we could prove everything we suspect, the process would bankrupt anyone who tried to fund it. Mac turned from the window to face the Miller family directly. David, what was your annual salary at the bank? The question seemed to come from nowhere, but David answered automatically. $68,000. Emma, what did you make teaching? $42,000. Emma replied, clearly puzzled by the direction of Mac's questions. So your family income was about $110,000 a year. Comfortable for this area, enough to support your family and save for the future. Mac's voice carried the measured tone of someone laying out a business proposition. This ranch generates about 4 times that much in annual income, and I have investment accounts that my financial advisor tells me are worth more than I could spend in 2 lifetimes. The implications of Mac's statement settled over the room like a physical presence. He wasn't just offering to help the Miller family recover from their losses. He was proposing to bankroll a comprehensive legal assault on Richard Blackwood's entire operation. Why would you do that? Emma asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Mac was quiet for a long moment, his gaze returning to the window and the land beyond it. 3 years ago, I lost the only person who ever made me want to be better than I was. Since then, I've been existing instead of living. going through the motions of ranching without any real purpose or connection to the world around me. He turned back to face them, and David could see something in Mac's eyes that hadn't been there the night before. Purpose, determination, the kind of focused intensity that had built successful ranches and raised strong families for generations. Yesterday, you showed up at my door with your children, asking for help because you had nowhere else to turn. But what you really brought me was something I thought I'd lost forever, a reason to fight for something that matters more than my own comfort or safety. The room fell silent except for the distant sound of Sophie and Tommy playing in the living room, their laughter a reminder of what was at stake in the larger battle they were contemplating. Mac's offer represented more than financial support. It was a commitment to transform his isolated existence into something meaningful, to honor Sarah's memory by protecting families like the one she had always wanted them to have. If we do this, David said slowly, if we really take on Blackwood and try to expose everything he's done, there's no going back. Once we file federal complaints and start involving outside investigators, he'll know we're coming for him. The retaliation will be immediate and overwhelming. Then we'd better make sure we're prepared for it, Mac replied. And we'd better make sure we have enough evidence to finish what we start. Emma reached for David's hand, the gesture carrying the weight of a shared decision that would define their family's future. How do we begin? Mac moved to his desk and pulled out a legal pad, his rancher's mind already organizing the complex task ahead of them. First, we contact every family whose foreclosure file you copied. We explain what we've discovered and offer them legal representation to challenge their cases. Some will be too scared to participate, but others will jump at the chance for justice. What about the political connections? The sheriff, the district attorney, the county commissioners who are in Blackwood's pocket? We work around them. Federal investigations don't require local cooperation, and in fact, evidence of local corruption makes the federal case stronger. Mac began writing names and tasks on the legal pad. We need a good attorney who specializes in banking fraud, a private investigator who can track down the families who left the area, and a forensic accountant who can analyze the financial patterns in Blackwood's acquisitions. David watched Mac work, seeing the transformation from isolated, grieving widower to determined strategist happening in real time. This is going to take months, maybe years. Are you sure you want to commit to something this extensive? Mac looked up from his notes, his expression carrying absolute certainty. David, for 3 years I've been waiting to die without admitting it to myself. Last night, for the first time since Sarah passed, I remembered what it feels like to have something worth living for. If we can stop Blackwood from destroying other families, if we can get justice for the people he's already hurt, then I'll have spent my remaining years doing something that matters. The commitment was made not with dramatic gestures or emotional speeches, but with the quiet determination of a man who had found his purpose again. Mac Thompson had been lost in grief for 3 years, but the Miller family's arrival had awakened something in him that transformed charitable impulse into righteous mission. Outside, storm clouds were gathering on the horizon again, promising another cold front that would test anyone caught without adequate shelter. But inside the ranch house, around Mac's desk with David's evidence spread before them, a different kind of storm was brewing. The kind that would shake Richard Blackwood's empire to its foundations and restore justice to families who had thought themselves powerless against overwhelming corruption. The fight they were planning would require everything Mac had learned about perseverance during 30 years of ranching, everything David knew about financial systems and documentation, and everything Emma understood about building coalitions and organizing communities. It would test their courage, their resources, and their commitment to each other in ways they couldn't yet imagine. But as Sophie and Tommy's laughter continued to drift in from the living room, Mac felt something he hadn't experienced since Sarah's death. Hope for a future that extended beyond his own survival, purpose that connected him to something larger than his personal loss, and the possibility that the most meaningful chapter of his life might still be ahead of him. Part 4. Reluctant assistance. The next morning brought an unexpected visitor to Thompson Ranch. Mac was in the barn checking on a cow that had been showing signs of illness when Rosa appeared in the doorway, her expression carrying the particular tension she reserved for situations that required diplomatic handling. "Mac, there's a man here to see you. Says he's from the bank." Rosa's voice carried a warning that made Mac immediately alert. He's sitting in his car by the front gate. Hasn't come up to the house yet. Max set down the medication he had been preparing to administer and followed Rosa outside, where he could see a black sedan parked at the entrance to his property. The vehicle's windows were tinted, making it impossible to identify the occupant, but its presence felt ominous in a way that had nothing to do with its appearance and everything to do with timing. "Tell David and Emma to keep the children inside and away from the windows," Mac instructed Rosa quietly. "And call Frank Wilson. Ask him to come over with his camera. If this is what I think it is, I want documentation." Rosa nodded and hurried back toward the house while Mac walked down the long driveway toward the waiting car. As he approached, the driver's door opened and a man in an expensive suit emerged, his demeanor carrying the polished confidence of someone accustomed to getting his way through a combination of authority and intimidation. "Mr. Thompson? I'm Richard Blackwood. I believe you know why I'm here." The introduction was delivered with the kind of practiced charm that successful businessmen use to disarm potential opposition, but Mac could see the calculation behind Blackwood's friendly expression. The man was younger than Mac had expected, perhaps 50, with the kind of artificial polish that spoke of expensive grooming and careful attention to image management. "Can't say that I do," Mac replied evenly, stopping about 10 feet from Blackwood's car and crossing his arms over his chest. "This is private property, and I don't recall inviting you onto it." Blackwood's smile didn't waver, but something shifted in his eyes that suggested Mac's response wasn't following the script he had anticipated. "Of course, you're absolutely right. I should have called first. I was hoping we could have a conversation about some mutual friends of ours, the Miller family." The mention of David and Emma's name confirmed Mac's suspicions about the purpose of this visit. Blackwood had somehow learned of their presence at the ranch and was making a preemptive move to neutralize whatever threat they might represent. The speed with which he had located them suggested surveillance capabilities that extended beyond simple business intelligence. "What about them?" "Well, I understand they've fallen on some hard times recently. Lost their home, their employment. Situation became challenging. It's always sad when good people struggle with financial difficulties." Blackwood's tone carried false sympathy that made Mac's jaw tighten. "I'm here because I'd like to help them get back on their feet." "How generous of you. I've always believed in supporting members of our community when they face unexpected hardships. In fact, I've been authorized to make the Miller family a very substantial offer that would resolve all their current financial problems and allow them to start fresh somewhere else." The phrasing of Blackwood's offer was careful, designed to sound benevolent, while carrying clear implications about the alternative consequences of refusing his generosity. Mac had dealt with enough predators over the years to recognize the underlying threat that accompanied such carefully worded proposals. "What kind of offer?" Blackwood reached into his jacket and withdrew a folded document. "A settlement agreement that would compensate them for any perceived irregularities in their foreclosure proceedings. $200,000, tax-free, in exchange for signing a comprehensive non-disclosure agreement and relocating outside of Texas within 30 days. Mac accepted the document but didn't unfold it. His attention focused on reading Blackwood's expression rather than the legal language that undoubtedly favored the banker's interests. "That's a lot of money for people who you claim haven't been wronged by your business practices." "It's a lot of money for anyone," Blackwood agreed. "Enough to buy a nice house in a different state, start over completely, maybe even start a small business. All they have to do is acknowledge that their foreclosure was handled properly and agree not to make any further claims against my companies." The offer was simultaneously generous and insulting, providing enough money to solve the Miller family's immediate problems while requiring them to abandon any pursuit of justice for themselves or other victims of Blackwood's fraud. It was the kind of deal that desperate people might accept without considering the broader implications of their silence. "And if they're not interested in your offer?" Blackwood's expression grew regretful, though the emotion seemed as artificial as his earlier friendliness. "Well, that would be unfortunate. You see, I've recently learned that David Miller may have violated his employment agreement by copying confidential bank documents. That's a serious crime, Mr. Thompson. Industrial espionage, theft of proprietary information, potentially even identity theft if he accessed customer records without authorization." The threat was delivered with the casual tone of someone discussing weather conditions But Mac understood that Blackwood was outlining the legal assault he would launch against David if the family refused to accept his settlement offer. Federal charges, years of legal proceedings, and the possibility of prison time that would destroy whatever remained of the Miller family's future. Seems like you're caught between wanting to help them and wanting to prosecute them, Mac observed. Must be confusing to have such conflicting impulses. Not confusing at all. I'm hoping they'll choose the path that allows everyone to move forward positively rather than the path that forces me to protect my business interests through less pleasant means. Frank Wilson's pickup truck appeared at the end of Mac's driveway. The elderly rancher's timing perfect for providing witness to whatever confrontation was developing. Frank had been Mac's neighbor for 20 years and understood the unspoken communications that passed between men who had spent their lives dealing with various forms of predators, both animal and human. That's an interesting perspective on protection, Max said, aware that Frank was now within earshot and would catch the implications of whatever Blackwood said next. Most folks around here understand protection to mean defending something valuable from outside threats, not eliminating people who point out problems. Blackwood's polished demeanor began to show cracks as he realized that Mac wasn't responding to his combination of bribery and intimidation with the compliance he had obviously expected. Mr. Thompson, I hope you understand what you're involving yourself in. The Miller family's problems stem from their own poor decisions, and anyone who enables their continued irresponsible behavior might find themselves facing similar challenges. The threat was more direct now, Blackwood's carefully maintained facade slipping to reveal the ruthless calculation beneath his businessman's polish. Mac felt a familiar surge of the protective anger that had once driven him to build fence lines in blizzards and stand guard over newborn calves during coyote season. But this time, the threat wasn't to livestock or property. It was to a family with children who had already suffered more than any decent people should have to endure. Frank, Mac called to his approaching neighbor. I'd like you to meet Richard Blackwood. He was just explaining his philosophy about community support and how he protects his business interests. Frank Wilson stepped out of his truck with the deliberate movements of a man who had learned to assess dangerous situations before committing to action. At 73, he was still lean and sharp-eyed, with the kind of practical wisdom that came from surviving 7 decades of Texas weather, economic downturns, and the various challenges that defined rural life. Mr. Blackwood, Frank said, extending his hand with exaggerated courtesy. I've heard quite a bit about your business methods lately. Seems like you've been mighty busy acquiring properties throughout the county. Blackwood shook Frank's hand, his politician's instincts automatically engaging despite his obvious irritation at the interruption. Just trying to contribute to the economic development of the region. Rural communities need investment and modernization to remain viable in today's economy. Interesting perspective, Frank replied, his tone carrying the kind of dry skepticism that came naturally to men who had spent their lives distinguishing between honest dealing and sophisticated fraud. Of course, some folks might say that destroying established families and businesses isn't exactly what most people would call economic development. The conversation was taking on the careful quality of a negotiation between adversaries who understood that direct confrontation might be counterproductive, but who wanted to establish clear positions regarding their respective intentions and capabilities. Mac appreciated Frank's support, but he also recognized that Blackwood's presence at his ranch represented an escalation that would have consequences regardless of how this particular encounter concluded. Mr. Thompson, Blackwood said, returning his attention to Mac while clearly acknowledging that Frank's presence had changed the dynamics of their discussion. I hope you'll encourage your guests to consider my offer seriously. It represents a genuine opportunity for them to put their recent difficulties behind them and start fresh somewhere else. I'll make sure they know about your visit, Mac replied carefully. But the decision about what to do with your offer will be theirs to make. Of course, though I hope they understand that opportunities like this don't remain available indefinitely. Market conditions change, legal situations become more complex, and what seems generous today might not be possible tomorrow. The warning was delivered with the kind of casual menace that characterized Blackwood's entire approach to opposition, threatening enough to communicate serious consequences while remaining vague enough to maintain plausible deniability. Mac had encountered similar tactics from cattle buyers who tried to pressure ranchers into accepting below-market prices by suggesting that future offers would be even less favorable. "I'm sure they'll give your proposal the consideration it deserves," Max said, his tone making it clear that the conversation was over. Blackwood nodded once, then reached into his jacket again and withdrew a business card that he offered to Mac. "My personal number is on the back. If you have any questions about the offer, or if you'd like to discuss other matters that might be of mutual interest, please don't hesitate to call." The implication that Mac himself might become a target of Blackwood's attention was unmistakable, though delivered with the same polished courtesy that had characterized the entire encounter. As Blackwood returned to his car and drove away, Mac found himself reassessing the scope of what he had committed to when he offered to help the Miller family fight their battles. "That man's trouble," Frank said simply, watching the sedan disappear down the county road. "The kind of trouble that doesn't go away just because you ignore it." "I know," Mac replied, still holding Blackwood's business card and settlement offer. "Question is, what do we do about it?" Frank studied Mac's face with the attention of someone who had known him for 2 decades, reading the signs of transformation that had been building since the Miller family's arrival. Seems like you've already decided what you're going to do. Question is whether you're prepared for what comes next." The two men walked back toward the ranch house in comfortable silence, each understanding that the morning's encounter had moved their situation beyond simple charity or neighborly assistance. Blackwood's visit confirmed that David Miller's evidence represented a genuine threat to powerful interests, and that those interests were prepared to use both financial incentives and legal intimidation to neutralize opposition. Inside the house, the Miller family was waiting in the kitchen, their faces showing the strain of people who had learned to read adult conversations for signs of danger. David stood protectively near Emma and the children, while Rosa busied herself with unnecessary tasks that kept her within earshot of whatever news Mac might bring. "Blackwood came to make you an offer," Mac said without preamble, setting the folded settlement agreement on the kitchen table. $200,000 to sign a non-disclosure agreement and leave Texas within 30 days. David's face went pale as he reached for the document, his hands trembling slightly as he unfolded it and began reading the legal language that would define his family's future. Emma moved to read over his shoulder, her expression growing more troubled as she absorbed the implications of Blackwood's proposal. "It's everything we talked about," Emma said quietly. "Enough money to start over somewhere else, buy a house, maybe even start a small business. The children could have stability. Again, good schools, a normal life." The longing in her voice was painful to hear, reflecting the exhaustion of a mother who had watched her children suffer while she and her husband pursued justice that seemed increasingly unlikely to materialize. Mac understood the temptation, represented by Blackwood's offer, the appeal of accepting defeat in exchange for security. "What happens if we don't sign?" David asked, though his expression suggested he already knew the answer. "He mentioned that you might have violated your employment agreement by copying bank documents. Said it could be considered industrial espionage, theft of proprietary information, maybe even identity theft." David sank into a chair, the weight of impossible choices settling on his shoulders like a physical burden. "Federal charges. Years of legal proceedings, even if we eventually won. The children would be adults before it was over, and there's no guarantee we wouldn't end up in prison anyway. But if we sign this," Emma said, her voice growing stronger as her teacher's instincts for protecting vulnerable people asserted themselves, "what happens to all the other families? The Rodriguez family, the Hernandez Ranch, the elderly couple who lost their retirement home? Do they just remain victims forever because we were too scared to fight?" The moral dimension of their decision hung in the kitchen air like smoke, impossible to ignore and painful to acknowledge. Accepting Blackwood's offer would solve the Miller family's immediate problems while abandoning any hope of justice for the dozens of other families who had suffered similar losses. "There's something else," Max said, his voice cutting through their internal debate. "Blackwood knows you're here, which means he has people watching this ranch or tracking your movements somehow. Taking his money won't make you safe if he decides you still represent a threat to his operations." Frank nodded in agreement. "Man like that doesn't pay $200,000 to make problems go away. He pays it to buy time while he figures out a permanent solution. You take his money, you'll spend the rest of your lives looking over your shoulders, wondering when he'll decide you know too much to be allowed to live peacefully anywhere." The harsh assessment brought a new level of clarity to their situation. Blackwood's offer wasn't really about resolving their conflict. It was about controlling the terms of their eventual destruction. By accepting his money, they would be admitting guilt to the industrial espionage charges he could file whenever convenient, while also binding themselves to legal agreements that would prevent them from seeking help or protection. So what are our real options? David asked. Mac moved to the kitchen window, looking out over land that had sustained his family for more than a decade, thinking about the choice between safety and principle that every generation seemed forced to make in one form or another. We can run or we can fight. But if we're going to fight, we need to do it right. What does fighting right look like? Emma asked. It means going on the offensive instead of just defending ourselves. It means gathering enough evidence to destroy Blackwood's entire operation before he can destroy us. And it means building alliances with people who have the power to protect us while we're doing it. Mac turned back to face the family, his expression carrying the kind of determined certainty that had enabled him to build a successful ranch despite drought, economic downturns, and every other challenge that rural Texas could present. I've been thinking about this since yesterday, and I believe we have advantages that Blackwood doesn't fully understand yet. What kind of advantages? First, he thinks you're just another desperate family that can be bought off or intimidated into silence. He doesn't know that you've found someone with the resources to fund a real investigation and the connections to protect you while it's happening. David looked skeptical. Mac, I appreciate everything you've done for us, but Blackwood has millions of dollars and political connections throughout the state. What makes you think we can compete with that level of influence? Mac smiled for the first time since Blackwood's visit, the expression carrying hints of the strategic thinking that had made him successful in an industry where survival required outmaneuvering both natural forces and economic predators. Because I've been talking to people since yesterday, and it turns out that Blackwood's reputation extends beyond Texas. There are federal investigators who have been tracking suspicious patterns in rural foreclosures across multiple states, and they've been looking for exactly the kind of evidence you collected. The revelation changed the entire emotional atmosphere in the kitchen, replacing despair and impossible choices with the first genuine hope the Miller family had felt in months. Rosa, who had been listening while maintaining her careful attention to kitchen tasks, looked up with an expression that clearly indicated her approval of this new direction. You contacted federal investigators? Emma asked, her voice carrying disbelief and excitement in equal measures. Yesterday afternoon, while you were helping the children get settled, I called my attorney in Austin, explained the situation, and asked him to reach out to contacts he has in federal law enforcement. Turns out the FBI has been building cases against several rural lending operations that show patterns similar to what Blackwood is doing here. David leaned forward, his exhaustion temporarily forgotten in favor of focused attention. What kind of patterns? Systematic foreclosure fraud across multiple states, always involving properties with high development potential or valuable water rights. Shell companies that acquire foreclosed properties and then flip them to larger development corporations. Political corruption at the local level that prevents effective oversight of lending practices. The scope of what Mac was describing suggested that their local battle with Blackwood was actually part of a much larger criminal enterprise, one that had attracted the attention of investigators with resources and authority that exceeded anything the banker could neutralize through local influence. But federal investigations take years, David said, his practical experience with bureaucracy tempering his excitement. Even if they're interested in our evidence, how does that help us deal with Blackwood's immediate threats? Because once you're officially cooperating with a federal investigation, threatening you becomes a federal crime. Witness intimidation, obstruction of justice, conspiracy charges that carry serious prison time, even for people with expensive lawyers and political connections. Frank, who had been listening quietly while assessing the strategic implications of Mac's revelations, nodded approvingly. Smart thinking. Turn their own tactics against them. Make it more dangerous for them to threaten you than to leave you alone. The investigator I spoke with is flying down from Dallas tomorrow morning. Special Agent Jennifer Martinez specializes in financial crimes involving federally insured institutions. She wants to review David's evidence and determine whether It supports the patterns they've been tracking in other cases. Emma reached for David's hand, the gesture carrying shared relief and renewed determination. So we wouldn't be fighting this alone anymore. Not just not alone, Mac replied. You'd be part of something bigger, something that could help dozens or hundreds of families who have suffered the same losses you have. And you'd have legal protection that Blackwood can't override through local connections. The kitchen fell, silent as the family absorbed the implications of Mac's proposal. Federal cooperation represented both opportunity and additional risk, requiring them to commit fully to a course of action that would make reconciliation with Blackwood impossible, while offering genuine hope for justice that extended beyond their personal situation. What about the children? Emma asked, her maternal instincts focusing on the practical considerations of their decision. If we're cooperating with federal investigators, if Blackwood sees us as a serious threat, what kind of life will Sophie and Tommy have while all this is happening? Mac had anticipated this concern, understanding that parents facing difficult choices would always prioritize their children's welfare over abstract principles of justice. They'll have the kind of life children should have: safe, stable, surrounded by people who care about them. This ranch has plenty of room. Good schools are within driving distance, and Rosa has been wanting grandchildren to spoil for longer than she'll admit. Rosa's face broke into a smile that confirmed Mac's assessment of her feelings about having children in the house again. These babies need a home where they can play and laugh without worrying about where their next meal will come from. This house has been too quiet for too long. You're talking about us staying here permanently, David said, his voice carrying amazement and uncertainty. Mac, we're grateful for everything you've done, but we can't let you support our family indefinitely while we fight a legal battle that might take years to resolve. You're not letting me do anything, Mac replied firmly. I'm choosing to do what's right for people I care about, using resources that have been sitting idle while I wallowed in self-pity for 3 years. Besides, this ranch needs the kind of energy that comes with having a family around. The offer was more than financial support or temporary shelter. It was an invitation to become part of something permanent, to build the kind of multi-generational ranch family that had sustained rural communities for generations. Mac was proposing not just to help them fight Blackwood, but to create the family structure that his own grief had prevented him from pursuing through traditional means. Take the night to think about it, Mac continued. Talk to each other. Consider all the implications. Make sure you understand what you'd be committing to. But whatever you decide, decide it together, and decide it based on what's best for your family, not what you think you owe me or anyone else. As evening settled over Thompson Ranch and the Miller family retreated upstairs to discuss their options in private, Mac found himself standing once again at his kitchen window, looking out over land that suddenly seemed filled with possibilities he hadn't imagined since Sarah's death. The arrival of desperate strangers at his door had awakened something in him that transformed charitable impulse into purposeful mission, offering him the chance to build something meaningful from the ruins of his solitary grief. Tomorrow would bring federal investigators, legal documents, and the beginning of a battle that would test everyone's courage and commitment. But tonight, Mac Thompson went to sleep in a house filled with children's voices, family conversations, and the sound of hope being cautiously rebuilt by people who had learned that sometimes the most important fights were the ones that seemed impossible to win. The war against Richard Blackwood was about to begin in earnest, but the Thompson Ranch was no longer a place of isolation and surrender. It had become headquarters for a resistance that would either restore justice to their community or teach them all the true cost of standing up to overwhelming power. Either way, Mac thought as he drifted off to sleep, it would be the most meaningful use of his remaining years, the best way to honor Sarah's memory, and the chance to build the family he had always wanted, just not in the way he had originally imagined. The federal investigator arrived at Thompson Ranch precisely at 9 o'clock the following morning, her punctuality reflecting the professional discipline that had made Special Agent Jennifer Martinez one of the FBI's most effective financial crime specialists. Mac watched from his front porch as the unmarked government sedan navigated his long driveway, noting the careful way the driver surveyed the property before parking near the main house. Agent Martinez stepped out of the car with the controlled awareness of someone accustomed to potentially dangerous situations, though her appearance was more suited to a corporate boardroom than a cattle ranch. She was younger than Mac had expected, perhaps 40, with sharp intelligence evident in her dark eyes and the kind of confident bearing that came from successfully prosecuting cases against powerful defendants. "Mr. Thompson, I'm Special Agent Martinez. Thank you for reaching out to us about this situation." Her handshake was firm, professional, and carried the subtle assessment of someone trained to read people quickly and accurately. "I understand you have some interesting information about foreclosure irregularities in this area." "More than interesting," Mac replied, leading her toward the house. "We have documentation that suggests systematic fraud involving dozens of families and multiple financial institutions. The Miller family is inside, along with the evidence they collected before their lives were destroyed for asking inconvenient questions." Agent Martinez nodded, her expression indicating that Mac's description aligned with patterns she had encountered in other investigations. "Before we begin, I need to make sure everyone understands what cooperation with a federal investigation entails. There are protections, but there are also risks, and once we officially open a case file, there's no going back to private resolution of these matters." The warning was delivered with the matter-of-fact tone of someone who had seen civilian. Witnesses underestimate the consequences of challenging powerful criminal enterprises. Mac appreciated her directness, understanding that she was offering them one final opportunity to reconsider their decision before crossing a line that would make them permanent enemies of Richard Blackwood. Inside the house, the Miller family was waiting in Mac's home office, the flash drive containing David's evidence connected to the laptop and ready for review. Agent Martinez took a moment to study each family member, her trained eye assessing their credibility and emotional stability with the kind of professional evaluation that would determine whether they could withstand the pressures of a complex federal prosecution. "Mr. Miller, I understand you were employed by First National Bank when you discovered these irregularities. Can you walk me through exactly what you found and how you documented it?" David's account of his discovery process was methodical and comprehensive, covering his initial suspicions about the Hernandez foreclosure, his systematic review of additional files, and his growing understanding of the fraudulent patterns that characterized Blackwood's acquisitions. Agent Martinez listened without interruption, occasionally making notes, but primarily focused on evaluating the reliability of David's observations and the quality of evidence he had gathered. "Show me the documentation," she said when David finished his narrative. For the next 2 hours, Agent Martinez reviewed every file David had copied, cross-referencing payment records with foreclosure documents and identifying the specific alterations that had created artificial defaults. Her examination was thorough and professional, reflecting the kind of meticulous attention to detail that characterized successful federal prosecutions of complex financial crimes. "This is good work," she said finally, looking up from the laptop screen. "The documentation is clear, the pattern is consistent, and the scope suggests criminal conspiracy rather than isolated incidents of poor record-keeping. What I'm seeing here supports similar patterns we've identified in Oklahoma, Arkansas, and New Mexico." Emma leaned forward, hope and anxiety competing in her expression. "Similar patterns? Rural foreclosure fraud targeting properties with development potential or valuable water rights. Shell companies acquiring foreclosed properties at below-market prices, then flipping them to larger development corporations. Local political corruption that prevents effective oversight of lending practices." Agent Martinez closed the laptop and turned her full attention to the family. "Mr. Blackwood appears to be running a regional operation that has attracted federal attention for some time. The revelation that their local battle was part of a larger criminal enterprise provided both validation and perspective on the scope of what they were confronting." Mac felt a grim satisfaction at learning that his instincts about Blackwood's methods had been accurate, while also understanding that federal interest in the case would escalate the danger they all faced. "What happens next?" Mac asked. "That depends on whether the Miller family is willing to serve as federal witnesses in a case that will likely take years to prosecute and will require them to testify about Blackwood's operations in multiple jurisdictions." Agent Martinez's tone made it clear that she was offering them a choice with permanent consequences, requiring absolute commitment to a course of action that would make them targets of a criminal organization with resources and connections throughout the region. "What kind of protection would we have?" David asked. Witness protection services, if necessary, though we prefer to keep cooperating witnesses in their normal environments when possible. Federal oversight of any attempts at intimidation or retaliation. Legal immunity for Mr. Miller's document copying activities, since they were conducted in good faith to expose criminal behavior. The protections offered were substantial, but Agent Martinez's careful phrasing indicated that they came with responsibilities and risks that extended far beyond their current situation. Becoming federal witnesses would transform the Miller family from local victims into key components of a multi-state prosecution that would inevitably attract violent opposition. How long before you could move against Blackwood? Emma asked. Immediate arrests aren't likely. Building federal cases requires extensive investigation, coordination with multiple agencies, and careful attention to constitutional requirements that ensure convictions will stand up on appeal. Agent Martinez leaned back in her chair, her expression indicating the kind of professional patience that characterized long-term federal investigations. We're talking about months of additional evidence gathering before we move to prosecution phase. Mac had anticipated this timeline, understanding that federal cases prioritized thoroughness over speed, but he also recognized that months of investigation would require the Miller family to maintain their courage and commitment while living under constant threat from Blackwood's organization. What about immediate protection? Mac asked. Blackwood visited yesterday to offer them a settlement that was basically extortion disguised as generosity. If they refuse his offer and commit to cooperating with your investigation, he's going to escalate his intimidation tactics. Agent Martinez nodded, clearly familiar with the progression of tactics used by criminal organizations to silence opposition. We can provide immediate federal protection through several mechanisms. Official witness status, which makes threatening them a federal crime. Electronic surveillance that documents any intimidation attempts. Coordination with local law enforcement that bypasses potentially compromised officials. The offer of federal protection was reassuring, but Mac understood that it also represented a fundamental change in how the Miller family would live their lives. Government oversight, electronic surveillance, and the constant awareness of being targets would create a different kind of stress than simple poverty and homelessness. There's one more thing, Agent Martinez said, her tone indicating that she was about to reveal information that would affect their decision. Our investigation has identified evidence that Blackwood's organization has used violence against opposition in other jurisdictions. Property destruction, assault, and in 2 cases, suspicious deaths of people who were preparing to testify against him. The room fell silent as the implications of this revelation settled over everyone present. They weren't just dealing with financial fraud and political corruption. They were confronting a criminal organization willing to use murder to protect its operations. You're telling us that cooperating with your investigation could get us killed, David said, his voice carrying the hollow tone of someone who had thought he understood the worst possible consequences of his situation. I'm telling you that Blackwood has demonstrated a willingness to use extreme measures when he perceives serious threats to his organization. But I'm also telling you that federal protection has prevented violence in similar cases, and that prosecution is the only way to permanently neutralize the threat he represents. Agent Martinez stood and moved to the window overlooking Mac's ranch, her posture reflecting the weight of decisions that affected civilian lives in ways that law enforcement officers sometimes struggled to fully comprehend. The choice is yours to make, but you need to understand that there are no safe options at this point. Blackwood knows you have evidence, and he's demonstrated that he views opposition as something to be eliminated rather than negotiated with. Mac joined her at the window, looking out over land that had suddenly become a potential battlefield in a conflict that extended far beyond his personal desire to help desperate strangers. What would federal protection look like in practical terms? On-site security when necessary. Electronic monitoring of communications and property. Immediate response to any threats or suspicious activity. Coordination with U.S. Marshals Service if relocation becomes necessary. The level of protection offered indicated both the seriousness of the threat and the value that federal investigators placed on David's evidence. Mac understood that accepting such extensive government involvement would transform his ranch from private property into something resembling a secure facility, with all the restrictions and complications that such status would entail. "We need time to discuss this as a family," Emma said, her voice carrying the kind of maternal protectiveness that prioritized her children's welfare over all other considerations. "Of course, but I need to emphasize that time is a luxury that may not be available much longer. Blackwood's visit yesterday suggests that he's moving to resolve this situation quickly, and delay in accepting federal protection could leave you vulnerable to escalating pressure." Agent Martinez returned to her chair and extracted a business card from her jacket pocket. "My direct number is on here. When you make your decision, call immediately. Federal protection can be activated within hours, but it requires official cooperation agreements that must be signed before we can provide comprehensive coverage." After Agent Martinez departed, the Miller family spent the remainder of the morning walking around Thompson Ranch, ostensibly touring the property but actually engaging in the kind of serious family discussion that would determine their future. Mac watched them from his kitchen window, giving them privacy while remaining available if they needed additional information or perspective. Rosa, who had been remarkably quiet during Agent Martinez's visit, busied herself with preparing lunch, while obviously thinking through the implications of what they had learned. Her opinion would carry significant weight with Mac, and he could see her working through the practical challenges of living under federal protection while maintaining any semblance of normal family life. "What do you think?" Mac asked her quietly. "I think those children deserve better than spending their childhood afraid of bad men who might hurt their parents." Rosa's voice carried the fierce protectiveness of someone who had raised her own children in circumstances that required constant vigilance against various forms of danger. "But I also think running away won't make them safe if this man is as dangerous as the agent suggested." Mac nodded, understanding that Rosa had reached the same conclusion he had been approaching since Agent Martinez's revelations about violence in other jurisdictions. Safety wasn't something the Miller family could achieve through compliance or avoidance. It required confronting Blackwood through the only mechanism powerful enough to neutralize him permanently. When the family returned to the house for lunch, their faces showed the strain of people who had been forced to choose between options that all carried unacceptable risks. David's expression was grim but determined, while Emma showed the particular exhaustion of a mother who had been asked to gamble her children's safety on the effectiveness of federal protection. "We've decided to cooperate with the investigation," David announced, his voice carrying the finality of a choice that admitted no second-guessing. "But we want to establish some conditions about how the protection is implemented, particularly regarding the children's daily routines and schooling." Mac felt a surge of pride and concern in equal measures, admiring their courage while worrying about the challenges they would face in the months ahead. "What kind of conditions?" "The children need stability and normalcy as much as possible. That means regular school attendance, the ability to make friends, participation in activities that help them feel like normal kids rather than witnesses in hiding." Emma's voice carried the kind of determined maternal planning that prioritized long-term psychological health over short-term security concerns. "We've spent months living in uncertainty, and the children have suffered from not having any routine or sense of safety. Whatever protection the government provides needs to allow them to experience childhood instead of just survival." The requirements they were establishing reflected the family's understanding that federal protection was a means to an end rather than an end in itself. That victory over Blackwood would be meaningless if it came at the cost of their children's emotional development and future opportunities. Agent Martinez said federal protection could be tailored to specific situations, Max said. "Security doesn't have to mean isolation if it's handled properly. That's what we're hoping. But we want to make sure those agreements are in writing before we sign anything that commits us to years of cooperation." David's caution reflected his experience with legal documents that contained unexpected obligations and restrictions, understanding that federal agencies might have different priorities than the families they were supposed to protect. Mac moved to his desk and retrieved Agent Martinez's business card, understanding that their decision represented a point of no return for everyone involved. "Should I call her now?" David and Emma exchanged a final glance, the kind of wordless communication that characterized couples who had survived crisis together and learned to trust each other's judgment completely. "Yes," Emma said simply. "Let's finish what we started." As Mac dialed Agent Martinez's number, he felt the same mixture of anticipation and resolve that had characterized every major decision in his ranching career, the understanding that commitment to a course of action required acceptance of consequences that couldn't be fully predicted or controlled. The Thompson Ranch was about to become something unprecedented in Mac's experience. A family home under federal protection, headquarters for a prosecution that would either restore justice to their community or teach them all the true cost of challenging overwhelming power. Either way, Mac thought as he waited for Agent Martinez to answer, it would be the most meaningful chapter of his life since Sarah's death, the chance to build something lasting from the wreckage of his isolated grief. The war against Richard Blackwood was about to escalate beyond anything any of them had imagined, but they would face it as a family, with federal law enforcement backing and the determination that came from knowing they were fighting for more than their own survival. They were fighting for the right of ordinary families to exist without fear of predators who viewed other people's homes and livelihoods as opportunities for exploitation. The phone rang twice before Agent Martinez answered, her voice carrying the professional alertness of someone who understood that urgent calls often signaled dangerous developments. Agent Martinez, this is Mac Thompson. The Miller family has made their decision. They want to cooperate with your investigation. Part 4 Final. Justice and new beginnings. Within hours of the Miller family's decision to cooperate with the federal investigation, Thompson Ranch transformed into something resembling a small military operation. 2 unmarked vehicles arrived, carrying additional FBI agents, electronic surveillance equipment, and the kind of communication gear that turned Mac's home office into a coordination center for a multi-state investigation. Agent Martinez supervised the installation with the efficient professionalism of someone who had protected witnesses in similarly dangerous situations, but Mac could see the concern in her expression as she reviewed intelligence reports about Blackwood's organization that had arrived since their morning meeting. The situation has accelerated faster than we anticipated, she explained to Mac while technicians installed monitoring equipment throughout the house. Our surveillance indicates that Blackwood held an emergency meeting last night with his key associates. Phone intercepts suggest they're planning immediate action to neutralize what they perceive as a serious threat to their operations. Mac felt his jaw tighten as he absorbed the implications of this intelligence. What kind of immediate action? We're not certain, but the pattern typically involves escalating pressure designed to force cooperation or silence. Property destruction, threats to family members, sometimes direct physical confrontation. Agent Martinez paused in her explanation to answer a phone call, her conversation conducted in the kind of law enforcement shorthand that indicated rapidly developing situations. When she finished the call, her expression had grown more serious. That was our surveillance team monitoring Blackwood's compound. 3 vehicles left his property 20 minutes ago, heading in this direction. We need to implement full security protocols immediately. The transformation of Thompson Ranch from peaceful cattle operation to federal protection site happened with startling speed. Additional agents took positions around the property perimeter while others established communication links with regional FBI offices and U.S. Marshal backup units. The Miller family was moved to an interior room of the house, while Rosa was temporarily relocated to Frank Wilson's ranch for her own safety. Mac found himself caught between admiration for the efficiency of federal protection and concern about the level of threat that required such extensive security measures. Looking out his kitchen window at agents positioned near his barn and fence lines, he wondered if his decision to help desperate strangers had transformed his home into something resembling a war zone. Mr. Thompson, Agent Martinez called from the living room, where multiple laptops displayed surveillance feeds from cameras positioned around his property. The vehicles approaching your ranch include Richard Blackwood himself, along with several associates who have criminal records involving assault and intimidation. Mac joined her at the surveillance station, studying the feed that showed 3 black SUVs moving slowly up his driveway. Even through the electronic imagery, he could see that the vehicle's occupants were conducting careful reconnaissance of his property, noting the placement of federal agents and assessing potential tactical advantages. What's the plan? Mac asked. We document everything, protect the family, and demonstrate that federal law enforcement takes witness intimidation seriously. Agent Martinez spoke into her radio, coordinating positions with agents stationed around the property. Blackwood is about to discover that threatening federal witnesses carries consequences he may not have anticipated. The convoy of SUVs stopped about 100 yards from Mac's house, positioning themselves in a way that blocked his driveway while providing clear sight lines to the main building. Mac counted at least 8 men emerging from the vehicles, all of them carrying themselves with the kind of aggressive confidence that suggested familiarity with violence and intimidation. Blackwood himself stepped out of the lead vehicle, no longer maintaining the polished businessman facade he had presented during his previous visit. His expression carried the cold calculation of someone preparing to eliminate opposition through whatever means proved necessary, and Mac felt a chill that had nothing to do with the Texas weather. Federal agents, this is Agent Martinez, came the amplified announcement from speakers that had been positioned around the property. You are trespassing on property under federal protection. Identify yourselves and state your business. The response from Blackwood's group was immediate and telling. Instead of retreating or attempting to negotiate, they spread into tactical positions that suggested military or law enforcement training. Several individuals reached inside their jackets, movements that clearly indicated concealed weapons. This is escalating beyond intimidation, Agent Martinez said, her voice carrying the controlled tension of someone managing a potentially deadly situation. They're positioning for an assault on a federal protection site, which represents a level of criminal stupidity that suggests desperation. Mac watched the developing confrontation with growing understanding of how completely his offer to help the Miller family had changed his life. 3 days ago, his greatest concern had been the isolation and purposelessness that had defined his existence since Sarah's death. Now he was watching armed criminals prepare to attack his home while federal agents coordinated defensive positions around his property. The standoff continued for nearly an hour, with Blackwood's men maintaining their positions while additional federal backup arrived from regional offices. Mac could see the calculation in Blackwood's posture as he assessed the growing law enforcement presence and weighed his options for proceeding with whatever plan he had formulated. Finally, Blackwood himself walked toward the house, moving with the deliberate confidence of someone accustomed to getting his way through a combination of money, influence, and implied threats. He stopped about 50 yards from Mac's front porch, close enough to be heard clearly, but far enough to maintain some tactical advantage. Thompson, he called, his voice carrying across the space between them. This federal protection won't last forever. Investigations end, agents get reassigned, and witnesses sometimes have accidents when they're no longer useful to the government. The threat was delivered with casual menace, but Mac could hear the frustration beneath Blackwood's controlled tone. The man had obviously expected his visit to the ranch to resolve the Miller family situation quickly and quietly, and the presence of federal protection represented a complication he hadn't anticipated. Mr. Blackwood, Agent Martinez responded through the amplification system. You are threatening federal witnesses while under surveillance by multiple law enforcement agencies. Every word you speak is being recorded and will be used as evidence in your prosecution for witness intimidation and conspiracy charges. The reminder that his threats were being documented seemed to penetrate Blackwood's anger, and Mac could see him reconsidering his approach as he absorbed the legal implications of his current behavior. Criminal conspiracy was one thing when conducted privately. Doing it in front of federal agents was the kind of mistake that destroyed even wealthy defendants with expensive legal representation. After several more minutes of tense standoff, Blackwood returned to his vehicle and led his convoy away from Thompson Ranch, but not before making a gesture toward the house that clearly communicated his intention to return when circumstances were more favorable to his objectives. Is it over? David asked when Agent Martinez gave the all-clear signal and allowed the Miller family to return to the main living areas of the house. This particular confrontation is over, Agent Martinez replied. But Blackwood's visit tells us several important things about his organization and his state of mind. He's desperate enough to personally threaten federal witnesses, which suggests our investigation has damaged his operations more than we initially realized. Mac appreciated her honesty about the ongoing nature of the threat, understanding that Resolution would require months of investigation and prosecution rather than a single dramatic confrontation. What happens now? Now we accelerate our timeline for building the federal case. Blackwood's behavior today provides additional charges we can file immediately, and his desperation suggests he might make other mistakes that strengthen our evidence. Over the following weeks, Thompson Ranch settled into a new routine that balanced family life with the realities of federal protection. The Miller children enrolled in the local school district under carefully monitored security arrangements, while David worked with FBI forensic accountants to expand the documentation of Blackwood's fraudulent operations. Emma found her teaching skills invaluable in helping organize the vast amount of evidence that federal investigators were gathering from multiple states, creating comprehensive databases that tracked patterns of fraud across Blackwood's entire criminal enterprise. Her work revealed the staggering scope of his operations, which had destroyed hundreds of families while generating tens of millions of dollars in illegal profits. Mack discovered that his ranch made an ideal headquarters for the federal investigation, providing secure meeting spaces while maintaining the kind of normal family environment that helped the Miller children adapt to their new circumstances. Rosa returned after additional security measures were implemented, and her presence restored the domestic stability that made the house feel like a home rather than a government facility. The breakthrough in the federal case came from an unexpected source. Janet Morrison, David's former supervisor at First National Bank, contacted Agent Martinez through her attorney and offered to provide evidence about Blackwood's operations in exchange for immunity from prosecution. Her cooperation revealed the internal structure of the fraud scheme, including documentation of bribes paid to local officials and detailed records of properties targeted for illegal acquisition. She kept copies of everything, Agent Martinez explained to the assembled group in Mack's living room, where the family had gathered to hear updates about the investigation's progress. Financial records, communication with Blackwood's associates, even recordings of meetings where they discussed eliminating opposition to their operations. David looked stunned by the revelation that his former supervisor had been documenting evidence while participating in the fraud that had destroyed his career. Why did she keep records of criminal activity? Insurance policy. People involved in criminal conspiracies often document their associates' activities to protect themselves if the operation is discovered. Morrison was smart enough to realize that Blackwood would sacrifice subordinates to protect himself if pressure from law enforcement became serious. Emma leaned forward, hope and skepticism competing in her expression. Does this mean the case is strong enough to prosecute? It means we have enough evidence to file federal charges against Blackwood and his key associates. Conspiracy, fraud, money laundering, witness intimidation, and several other felonies that carry significant prison sentences even for defendants with unlimited legal resources. The news represented vindication for the Miller family's decision to cooperate with federal investigators. But Mack understood that prosecution was only the beginning of a legal process that would require continued courage and commitment from everyone involved. 3 months later, the federal indictments were unsealed in a coordinated operation that resulted in arrests across 4 states. Richard Blackwood was taken into custody at his compound while attempting to destroy evidence, his desperate efforts to eliminate documentation providing additional charges for obstruction of justice. The local officials who had been compromised by Blackwood's influence were also arrested, including Sheriff Morrison and 2 county commissioners whose cooperation had enabled the fraud scheme to operate without effective oversight. The systematic corruption that had protected Blackwood's operations was dismantled in a single day of coordinated law enforcement action. Mack stood on his front porch on the morning of the arrests, watching sunrise paint the sky above his ranch in shades of gold and rose, thinking about how completely his life had been transformed by his decision to help desperate strangers. The Thompson Ranch had become home to a family he had never expected to have, headquarters for a federal investigation that had restored justice to hundreds of victims, and symbol of the possibility that ordinary people could challenge overwhelming power when they found the courage to stand together. David Miller had been offered his choice of positions with several banks that valued his expertise and integrity, while Emma had accepted a teaching position that allowed her to use her experience with the federal investigation to develop educational programs about financial literacy and consumer protection. The children had thrived in their new environment, developing the kind of confidence and security that came from living in a home where they were truly wanted and protected. "You know," Frank Wilson said, joining Mac on the porch with 2 cups of coffee and the morning newspaper, whose headline announced Blackwood's conviction on all federal charges. "I never thought I'd see the day when this old ranch would be famous for taking down a criminal empire." Mac accepted the coffee and smiled at his neighbor's observation. "I never thought I'd see the day when I'd have a family again, but sometimes life gives you exactly what you need when you're finally ready to accept it." The Miller family emerged from the house for breakfast, Sophie and Tommy racing across the yard toward the barn where they had established a morning routine of helping with ranch chores. Emma followed more sedately, her arm linked with David's, as they discussed plans for the day that included normal concerns about work schedules and children's activities rather than survival strategies and federal protection. "Rosa's making pancakes again," Emma announced, settling into one of the porch chairs that Mac had added to accommodate his expanded family. "She says it's to celebrate the newspaper article, but I think she just likes having children to spoil." Mac watched his adopted family settle into their morning routine, thinking about Sarah and how proud she would have been of the home they had built together. The ranch house that had echoed with loneliness for 3 years now rang with laughter and conversation, filled with the kind of multi-generational family structure that had sustained rural communities for generations. "What's next?" David asked, a question that had taken on new meaning now that their legal battles were concluded and their future was finally secure. Mac looked out over his land, where cattle grazed peacefully in fields that would eventually be inherited by Sophie and Tommy, thinking about legacy and the different ways people could build something meaningful from unexpected circumstances. "Next, we keep doing what we're doing. Raising cattle, raising children, taking care of each other, and remembering that sometimes the most important thing you can do is open your door when strangers show up asking for help." The simple truth of that statement settled over the porch like morning sunshine, warming everyone present with the understanding that their journey from desperation to justice to family had taught them something essential about courage, compassion, and the power of ordinary people to create extraordinary change when they found the strength to stand together against overwhelming odds. As the family moved inside for breakfast, Mac remained on the porch for a few more minutes, watching the sunrise paint his land in colors that seemed more vivid than they had appeared in years. The Thompson Ranch had become something he never could have imagined when grief and isolation had defined his existence, but it was exactly what he had needed to discover that the most meaningful chapters of his life were still ahead of him. The Miller family had arrived at his door hungry and homeless, asking for help that he had given reluctantly at first, but which had ultimately saved them all. They had found each other in the most unlikely circumstances, built trust through shared danger, and created the kind of family bond that transcended biology to embrace something deeper and more lasting. Richard Blackwood's criminal empire had been destroyed, dozens of families had received justice and compensation for their losses, and a network of corruption that had seemed untouchable had been dismantled through the courage of ordinary people who refused to accept defeat. But more importantly, Mac Thompson had learned that sometimes the greatest victories came not from what you achieved, but from what you were willing to sacrifice to protect the people you loved. The sound of children's laughter drifted from the kitchen, mixing with the gentle conversation of adults who had found their way home through trials that had tested everything they thought they knew about courage, family, and the possibility of justice in an imperfect world. It was the sound of hope fulfilled, of second chances embraced, and of the kind of family that was built not through accident of birth, but through deliberate choice to care for each other regardless of the cost. Mac Thompson smiled and headed inside to join his family for breakfast, understanding finally that the lonely rancher who had opened his door to desperate strangers had actually been the one who was rescued, saved from a life of meaningless isolation, by the simple act of choosing compassion over safety, connection over solitude, and love over the comfortable numbness of perpetual grief. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.